pleasure to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by DITOL. Our session today is The Encounter Between the Persian and the Sanskrit Worlds. Richard Eaton in conversation with William Dalrymple. Academic and author, Richard Eaton's book, India in the Persianate Age, is a diverse and rich account of the Indian subcontinent's interaction with cultures and people across the world through the centuries. Focusing on the introduction of Persianate culture into the region, the book explores the assimilation and integration of the traditions with India's Sanskritic cultures and into the fabric of our language, art, architecture, literature, cuisine, and a lot more. Richard is the professor of history at the University of Arizona. His other books include A Social History of the Deccan, 1300 to 1761, 8 Indian Lives and Essays on Islam and Indian History. In conversation with author and festival co-director William Dalrymple, Eaton takes on a journey through the influences and traditions that made India establish its diverse cultural roots. Richard Eaton has been obsessed with India ever since riding an elephant at the St. Louis Zoo at age 3, especially its long-term relations with Persian culture, Islam, and the Iranian plateau before the British period. He teaches history at the University of Arizona. William Dalrymple, ladies and gentlemen, is the best-selling author of In Xanadu, City of Djinns, From the Holy Mountain, Age of Kali, White Mughals, The Last Mughal, 9 Lives, Return of a King, and Kohinoor. His most recent books are The Anarchy, The Relentless Rise of the East India Company, and Forgotten Masters, Indian Painting for the East India Company. William is one of the founders and a co-director of the Jaipur Literature Festival. Please do remember to comment by typing it into the comment section. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Eaton in conversation with William Dalrymple.
Well, welcome to one of the more, I won't say controversial, but more disputed sessions of the Jaipur Literary Festival. In most countries, medieval history is a matter for nerdy antiquarians to debate matters of heraldry and rival preferences about armor and sword play. But in India, as we all know, the facts and the detail of what happened between the year 1000 and the year 1765, which are the two dates that Dick Eaton takes for his spectacular book, India in the Persianate Age, that's been up for all the major history awards this year, got rave reviews around the world, and so on. But these areas are matters now of deep debate in India. And Dick has seen the field he entered into sort of turn into a battlefield in front of him, in a sense, over the course of his career. And all the certainties and all the views that people held about it 30 years ago are now very much up for debate. And it's very exciting for us. It's, in a sense, exactly what Jaipur is here to do, to air these matters and to hear from the writers who are at the cutting edge, forming our opinions about what actually happened. And this, of course, in India is not just a matter of academic, scholarly fine-tuning. This is something that is really being debated every day. If anyone says anything about the Sultans or the Mughals on the internet or on Twitter, there is likely to be a full-scale debate, if not a war breakout, within a few minutes over this. And it's a brave man that takes this on, as Dick has done. Dick, I mean, when you look at this field, do you sort of wade in with trepidation, or do you feel it's really quite a simple matter? A historian's job is just to put down the facts, and what happens.
Well, I think every historian, by definition, is involved in revising earlier opinions. I mean, that's what we do. If we simply repeat what somebody said 10 years ago, then we're not really doing proper history. So I think any historian, by definition, is looking at the past with a different lens, asking different questions, probably looking at new data that was not known at earlier times. So I don't think there's anything unusual about my project, in the sense that this is what historians always do. Look at the data, ask new questions, and try to formulate answers to fundamental questions.
Are you more careful now about what you write than what you were writing, say, 25 years ago when you first started writing about this period? Do you feel you have to mince your words or alter your narrative at all?
I hope not. It seems to me that, of course, everything you do can be controversial, especially when you talk about culture, and especially when you talk about a period of India's history, which is, as you pointed out, rightly pointed out, is so controversial. Clearly, historians have to be very careful, make sure that what they write is indeed sustained by evidence, and that's exactly what I do. But yes, I think it is important to be measured. You don't want to simply, ramble into a topic like a rogue elephant and make outrageous statements which will excite passions around the world. I think that's a very irresponsible way of approaching the whole agenda. But yes, I'm very well aware of the controversial nature of many of the issues that I've been trying to explore throughout my career, beginning with the very first book on conversion. I mean, I began writing about conversion in the 1970s, early 1970s, before anyone else was really doing all that much. And of course, conversion, any kind of religious conversion question, is exactly one of those controversial topics that you're referring to. So yes, you're quite right.
But I have to say, I mean, your book, I haven't seen a single attack on it, unlike some other books about medieval history that have come out lately. I mean, by and large, your tactful nature seems to have got away with it so far. And I think you have managed to get your views across without creating sort of great Twitter battles or whatever.
I agree with you. I was kind of half anticipating that there would be a powerful reaction, a negative reaction to some of the assertions I make in the book. And I'm not quite sure how to explain that. Perhaps it's because some people have not simply read the book yet, or perhaps I'm actually right. I mean, I would hope that I'm right. I would hope. I would like to think that
it be widely read. I can certainly, as someone that lives in Delhi, I can tell you the book is widely available. It's been in every bookshop window, so it certainly isn't that it hasn't been read. But I would certainly opt for the tactful and judicious explanation rather than the having not been seen. So let's dive in. So paint a picture, if you would, Dick, of India in the year 1000. Are we? I mean, again, to put this into the context of the controversy, for many people, this is a golden age. This is India as a peaceful center of civilization, an almost Eden-like land, where India is leading in every field, in science, in architecture, in art. How far is that view based on fact? And are we talking a peaceful Eden, or is this like anywhere else in the human world, a land riven by differences and division?
I would suggest that is a very distorted view, and I have to say it's a view that was promoted in the colonial period, when the colonial rulers, the British colonial rulers, conceived of Indian history as in a tripartite way of a Hindu period, a Muslim period, and a modern period, or British colonial period. And that kind of tripartite division of time, in my view, is a projection of a European understanding of ancient, medieval, and modern, which was simply superimposed, as it were, on Indian history with a very tendentious purpose, a political purpose. Namely, it was necessary to some degree demonize the immediate predecessors of the Raj, and to do that meant constructing this model, as I say, which proposed that until the coming of the Turks and until roughly 1000 AD, there had been this, as you put it, a peaceful Eden-like country, which was then disturbed in this understanding, which was then not overthrown, but certainly derailed in some senses by Muslims. And conceiving of the invasions of the Aghorids and the Ghaznavids in specifically religious terms is something that was kind of baked into the subsequent historiography. And in a nutshell, what my book tries to do is to reconceive the entire project of understanding Indian history through the lens of religion, and more specifically of Hindu-Muslim conflict, which is something that was to a great extent exaggerated during the historiography of the colonial period. So, yes, I think
the
that
idea
one
being that the British created this series of sort of demonic Islamic figures against whom they placed their own rule as something benign and
exactly. Yes, and of course there was plenty in indigenous literature, both in Sanskrit and in Persian, that could be used to promote this argument of a demonic Muslim period. I don't mean to completely, whitewash the all of history, but I think it's a question of judgment. I think it's a question of degree, and I think it's if we look at contemporary evidence, we do not find the kind of stark Hindu-Muslim contrast or encounter that you would expect to find if you were only reading colonial literature. For example, the term that was typically used to describe the Muslims in the 11th and 12th century was not Musulman or Muslim, but Turushka, which is simply the Sanskrit word for Turk. In other words, these people who had occupied the Punjab and northern India in the 11th and 12th centuries were not construed as posing any kind of civilizational challenge, but rather they were simply seen as one more ethnic group, in their case, Turks. And it's only in modern historiography that the idea that these were not Turks, they were Muslims, or Muslims first and Turks second. And that's the kind of shift that I'm trying to come to in this book, is to understand that the traditional or conventional construction of a harsh religious encounter or even clash is something which needs to be re-examined. And the only way to do that is to go back to the contemporary evidence and look at, what are the Sanskrit texts saying? What are the Persian texts saying? And why do they say the things they do? That is the difficult part of any historical project, to kind of evaluate the original evidence with a view to understanding what most likely did happen.
The idea which has gained wide acceptance here over the last 10 years is that, to put against your idea of a colonial historiography, which has distorted history to make the Muslims look very bad, the idea which is widely believed here, rightly or wrongly, is that in the post-independence period, Nehruvian historians, many of whom were Marxists, deliberately underplay the amount of conflict, the amount of temple destruction, the amount of violence which took place with the coming of the Turks. Is there any truth in that? Do you think there was an underplaying of violence, or do you think that the violence was only part of the story, and what that generation of historians put out is a viable model?
Well, first of all, I think the word Marxist is misplaced here. At least the work that I do, it does not follow any kind of a Marxist agenda. And I think that word has been unfortunately misused to kind of, you know, denigrate a whole category of secular historians. I think the word secular would be better than Marxist, but
secular in that you would claim a certain sort of religious neutrality on the
yes, that would be the way I would put it. I think that's really what we're trying to do here. You must remember that after all, the whole national movement in India and the national movement in Pakistan, the two-nation theory was fundamentally a contrived notion that somehow, almost the moment when Muhammad bin Qasim arrived in the coast of Sindh in the 8th century, that there was already a Muslim nation in South Asia, but not yet a Muslim state. And the whole agenda of creating Pakistan was to transform or make a state from this nation. So the idea that there had been a separate nation of Muslims was, you could say, a necessary prerequisite for the whole idea of Pakistan. And one could equally say that provoked a counter-reaction on the Indian side, which of course is something we've been seeing ever since 1947. So yes, I think that historians therefore have had to navigate a very, very, very difficult project here in not appearing to exaggerate one side too far. And, you know, to go back to our first point, history is always going to be a contested field.
Dick, so let's go back to the beginning, to the year 1000. Paint a picture, because you open, perhaps rather surprisingly, not with a thrust in from Central Asia, but a thrust northwards from the Chola heartlands.
Yes, and this was not unusual. The thrust northward from the Chola heartland up into Bengal, and the raid, I would say, was not a conquest. There was no attempt to conquer territory and hold it. Was a way of beginning the book, it seemed to me, because it allowed me to compare and to contrast what had already been happening in South Asia before 1000 and what the Turks were doing in roughly that same period. There were definitely points of comparison and there were points of contrast. And I thought that the best way to introduce the Turks would be to talk about what was already there. And what was already there was a South Asia inhabited by many powers who were at war with each other. Why was this happening? Why was this a violent place? Well, there was this idea of the Mandala, of the Digvijaya. It was necessary for kings to create a kind of an idealized model based on concentric circles of friends and enemies and enemies.
And this is something you get in Chanakya and the Arthashastra, huh?
Right, that's exactly right. And these ideas were very powerful ideas. They were not just ideas that were floating around in the atmosphere somewhere. These ideas were actually being played out in real time, in real history. Kings, Maharajas were in fact engaged in more or less perpetual warfare on the model of this notion of the creating a mandala.
And again, just to be completely clear here, given that many people do believe that sort of pre-Muslim India was an Eden, would you like to describe the kind of nature of the Chola conquest? I mean, the kind of thing we read in Chalakya inscriptions, for example, about what the Cholas did when they conquered a country.
Well, I mean, when you read the actual Sanskrit prashastis that precede many inscriptions, not just in the case of the Cholas, in the case of the Chalukyas, who were their bitter enemies to the north in the central Deccan, and all across the North Indian plain, these inscriptions present a very, I mean, kings are presented as bloodthirsty, violent persons, and that's what they do. That's what you do when you write a eulogy of a king. You need to present them in these terms to be credible. And so I think the notion of a peaceful, non-violent India prior to the coming of the Turks is completely mistaken. We have plenty of evidence of temple destruction or temple desecration, of wars going on. And it was driven largely by this theory of what a king needs to do to establish himself in power. And it resulted in an extremely unstable South Asia, where no single king could ever acquire hegemony over the entire territory. It kind of left a kind of what we call an unstable equilibrium of perpetual warfare going on. And that was the...
And just to explain this is the Mandala theory is effectively in sort of in anecdotal English that my enemy's enemy is my friend. That
correct.
You have a series of concentric circles.
That's correct. Yeah, exactly. And that is not simply an abstract theory. That was something that was actually practiced, and we have plenty of evidence to show that. So when the Turks arrive in India, they are arriving in an atmosphere, in an area that was already infused with internal conflict, and they were simply one more group. They were the Tulishkas, they were the Turks, and they had their own mandala. And what's fascinating is that when the Ghurids actually do establish the very earliest decades of the Delhi Sultanate, what they in effect are doing is creating another mandala. They have all these defeated powers around them who are not totally annihilated. They are simply reduced to the status of subservient kings. So the notion of the mandala is something which is ultimately picked up and absorbed by the Turks themselves as they come in.
And you present two pieces of evidence to back this up in your book, if I remember, that the coinage is surprisingly similar to the Turkish coinage, and you also point out you have a lovely well near Palam, I think, which you quote.
Right. Yes.
Do you want to talk about that?
I mean, well, the coins. I mean, the earliest coins of Muhammad of Ghor are, in fact, identical to those of the Chauhanas, the very dynasty they had defeated. And what's interesting is that, you know, the Ghurids at that time were ruling not only over North India, but also into Khorasan and into Central Asia. And the coins that they minted for Khorasan and Central Asia were conventional Islamic coins with all Arabic inscriptions, no figures on it, no images whatsoever. But the coins that they were minting in North India for circulation among the Indian population conformed exactly to the Chauhana models, which would say
with gods and goddesses on the obverse.
The images of Lakshmi are there. The writing is in Sanskrit. And my argument would be that this is not only to provide a sense of continuity, which they were clearly trying to do, but it's also driven by economic necessity. The sharafs, the money changers, the merchants, the bankers simply would not accept money that did not look familiar to them. And right. We have to take that into account. This may have nothing at all to do with religion. There was a need to establish themselves, the Ghurids did, and they have to be credible to the bankers.
And this inscription on the well, talk about this a little, because that's very striking.
Well, this is there's an inscription that dates to the period of Balban's reign. This would be in the 1270s or 80s, late 13th century. It's a well that was patronized by a Brahmin, and it was built with a view to simply providing welfare for the local community. And the Prashasti, that is to say, the Sanskrit portion that is at the top of it, which is a certain kind of a glowing eulogy to the ruling emperor, in this case Balban, reads precisely like the Prashasti that you might have found in contemporary inscriptions from the Cholas, the Chalukyas, the Pallas, or any of the great emperors of North India or South India. In other words, what we find is in that inscription, and it's important to say this inscription was not written with a view to pleasing the rulers in Delhi itself, which is only, I don't know, 15 miles away or something, very close. They were written with a view to conforming to traditional understandings of how a king is to be perceived. And the most important thing is that the king is understood as protecting the property, in particular Brahmin property. So that view of the Sultan, it seems to me, needs to be taken very seriously. Insofar as Balban was understood as protecting the property, he was a good king. Now,
so, I mean, just to compare that to what, in a sense, you know, the Twitter version of medieval Indian history might imagine one to believe, that there were these foreign rulers of a different religion who regarded themselves as superior to the people they'd conquered, who leveled taxes based on religion on the conquered people, and who did destroy, we can debate how many, but did destroy some places of worship
yes.
Of that religion. How do we reconcile the words of that inscription in the well, who talks about, you know, the good ruler in Delhi who's protecting us, with the facts we know about you know, monasteries in Bihar being put to the flames, and the fact that, you know, there are so few temples from that period still extant in North India, and we see their, you know, we see their fragments in things like the mosque in Meroli beside the Qutub Minar, where we see previous temples which presumably had been destroyed being reused. How do we reconcile those two very different images?
Yes, that's a very good question. I would answer it this way. If you analyze the temples that were actually desecrated, what you discover is that those that were encountered in the context of the what we call a moving military frontier, and the first initial conquest did involve the destruction of temples, absolutely, and not just temples, but everything that could be found that was identified with ruling authority. But enemy kings were correctly understood as being ideologically dependent upon not just any temple, but the temple that was where the overlord, or whether it was a form of Vishnu or Shiva, was understood as the overlord of the kingdom. That image would be attacked, and that temple would be desecrated. And this is what happens.
Symbols of kingship were vulnerable, not temples in general. That's what you're saying.
Exactly. But and this is what we find in the Deccan as well. When the Delhi sultans first conquer the Deccan, they are indeed desecrating temples, and they are demonized for it in local inscriptions. But the important point is that once these conquerors are established in power and are demonstrably effective in maintaining order and peace, and above all, protecting Brahmin property, then everything changes. Then they are understood as perfectly good kings. That's the context in which we see Balban's inscription of Palam in the well.
You mentioned another fascinating inscription, I think, at a place called Veraval, near Somnath.
That's right.
Which backs up this impression of a world where two peoples are managing somehow to live together in a fair degree of peace and coexistence.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. That's in the coast of Gujarat. There you have a inscription which is bilingual. And it's fascinating to compare the Sanskrit version with the Persian version. It's on the same slab, after all, and they're slightly different. But the major point is that the maintenance of commerce and the maintenance of commercial interaction, after all, Verovol was a very important seaport exporting cotton across the Arabian Sea, and this was the mosque that you're referring to was patronized by a very rich Iranian merchant named Firuz. And he acquired permission from the temple authorities to build a mosque in that area. So there again, you see economic necessity trumping, as it were, any ideological issues that might arise.
And you talk very interestingly about the different words used for God on the two different inscriptions.
That's right. And what's interesting there is it appears to be a certain degree of a desire to achieve a modicum of commensurability. That what a Muslim would define as Allah would be described in Sanskrit terms as the maker of the universe, and you can translate these things any way you want.
Visvanatha or Sunyarupa.
Exactly. So that's right. And so theologically, it's interesting what's going on here is that the terms can be adjusted, but the important thing is the commerce must be maintained. We've got to keep the money coming in, and so that everybody's happy. That's clearly
no change from modern Gujarat to that sense, at least.
Exactly.
So we're still we're running out of time, and we haven't got, in a sense, to your main point, which is the building of a common Persianate culture. Way that tell us about the Premkyans, which are the beginning of this.
The Premkyans is a genre of literature. It's actually the first Hindi literature that we have. It appears in the 15th century, 16th century. And what's interesting about that literature is that these are written by oftentimes Sufis who are patronized by local rulers, especially in eastern North India. And what they do is they reflect the degree to which by the 15th century, these people who might be construed as initially having been outsiders have been thoroughly assimilated into North Indian culture. They're writing this remarkable genre of literature, which is ultimately Sufi in nature. It's all about the aspiration to achieve an awareness of the divine reality of God. But everything about the literature is thoroughly steeped in Indian culture. You've seen yogis, you see Jain monks. You have the atmosphere is entirely North Indian, and the fact that this literature is written in the Persian script, not in Devanagari, at least initially, has always posed a problem for the historians of Hindi, who would like you to believe that the first Hindi literature was written in Devanagari. The reality is that this literature actually was simply called Hindi, and nobody really cared about what script it was. It could have been in Devanagari. That does not become an issue until the 19th and 20th century, and that's the point. In the 15th century, people wrote in whatever script their patron wanted to have it written in, and it was not a big deal.
Right.
And that's one more example of how the 19th and 20th century has intruded in a way that distorts our understanding of this medieval period.
And just to conclude, as we're running out of time, in a sense, your main piece of evidence, in a sense, this is how, in your view, the colonial historians distorted Vijayanagara. They posed it as this great Hindu bastion of Hindu culture, besieged on all sides by rabid Muslim armies. You present a completely different picture in your book.
What you actually find is a totally different picture. You're quite right. I would suggest that both in the north and the south of the Deccan, both in Vijayanagara and in the Bathmani Sultanate to the north, all of these kingdoms are playing a double game. On the one hand, they are reaching back to the Chalukya period or the Kakatiya period by reusing architectural components, columns, water tanks, what have you, and placing them right at the very heart of their capitals in order to present the fact that, look, we are continuing the tradition of the great Chalukyas. The Chalukya was an empire that spanned all of the Deccan, both the north and the south. And so what you find is the sultans in the north, as well as the Rajas of Vijayanagara, are both plugging into that Chalukya past. On the other hand, they're also both plugging into the Persianate world. You find Krishnaraya, the great king of Vijayanagara, wearing this very tall hat called a kulai in Telugu.
We have a picture of him in the Pakshi, looking very Islamicate.
I've got a picture which I took myself. It was not previously known down there in Raichur. But he was not the only one. I mean, the court was really trying to demonstrate that they too belonged in this Persianate world. They too could be called sultans. They too were part of the same world, but that they built these so-called Chehel Satun, or 40-columned halls, which looked exactly like the kinds of halls that had been built in, say, Tughlaqabad or other great Persianate capitals. Indeed, there's a 100-column hall in the heart of Vijayanagara, which is modeled directly upon the famous 100-column hall in Persepolis, the great capital, the ceremonial capital of Darius and Cyrus the Great. So here you have in the Vijayanagara Empire a fascinating game being played here, according to which, on the one hand, they are reaching back to their indigenous roots, the Chalukyas, and on the other hand, they're reaching out to this wider Persianate world. They want to be in both worlds at the same time. And what's happening in Vijayanagara is exactly what's happening in the northern Deccan. So this whole idea of the Deccan plateau...
In the northern Deccan, the Bijapuris are dedicating their books to opening their hymns to Sarasvati and Ganesh. Ibrahim Adil Shah.
Exactly, Ibrahim II, Adil Shah, does precisely that. And in a sense, so does his predecessor, Ali Adil Shah, who writes this extraordinary text, the Nujum Ulum, in which you find elements of Sanskrit and Persianate worlds thoroughly mixed together, not only in the text, but also in the art and the paintings which accompany the text. So yes, I would suggest that this whole idea of a kind of a marginal line separating a northern Muslim Deccan from a southern Hindu Deccan is completely wrong and is overthrown by evidence, lots of evidence. Both
Dick,
literary evidence.
Sadly, we're out of time, but I would encourage anyone from any end of the political spectrum who wants to learn more about this from a historian who most definitely is not a Marxist. And we should say this loud and clear, because I think everyone assumes that anyone that's said anything nice about this period is somehow a thrall to Karl Marx. Should read Dick Eaton's extraordinary book, India in the Persianate Age, and it's a great fat tome. It's fully footnoted. Every statement is backed up with 100 footnotes, and it's really it has to be said, a very important text for our time, because this has become, for better or worse, one of the great debates of the present moment. So, Dick Eaton, thank you so much for being with us. We've longed to have you for many years. I'm very glad we've got you.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you, Willie.
Thank you, Richard and William Dalrymple, for this wonderful conversation. We thank our celebration partner, Diageo, and thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. As you are aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would love for you to support at Teamwork Arts. Any contribution is welcome and would help spread knowledge and ideas seamlessly against all odds. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 at Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you in the next session.